If I'm gonna make myself a cup of coffee, I tend to like it a particular way. And the odds are you probably like your coffee a particular way as well. But see, if you or I are gonna make what we think is a perfect cup of coffee, regardless of the brew method, there are a couple things that we need to do consistently. We need to consistently use a good tasting coffee, and we need to consistently use the right amount of coffee and water. And there are two ways to measure this: the scoop or the scale. Let's talk about it. So before I get into whether you should use a scale or a scoop or how to use a coffee brewing ratio, let's go back 5 years, because back then I didn't even know how to make coffee because I didn't drink coffee. But about 5 years ago, I got married, and I married a barista. So I know what you're thinking, that's how I got into drinking coffee. Well, sort of, because my wife, even though she'd been a barista for 10 years at that point, she didn't drink coffee either, but the company that she worked for used to send her home with bags of coffee. Now, she didn't actually use them, but she'd give them away to friends and family. But once we got married, she actually encouraged me to try drinking it, because even though she didn't like it, she thought maybe I would. And she was right. So she ground up some coffee for me at the cafe, she got me a French press, and said, have at it. And I remember the first time I brewed that coffee, and it was amazing. I didn't know that coffee could taste like that, because I had grown up with parents who used a percolator with pre-ground, really low quality coffee, and I never enjoyed the taste of it, and that's why I didn't drink it as an adult. But this was the first time I'd ever drank black coffee and was blown away by how delicious it was. And I remember thinking to myself, delicious is not a word I would have ever used to describe coffee without cream and sugar and a bunch of other crap in it. But it was amazing. And so the next day I made coffee again, and it was awesome. And the next day I made coffee, and it was awesome. And then I made coffee again, and it wasn't. And I went, well, hang on a second, what the heck? I think I did the same thing. I was using a French press at the time, and I think I filled it up to the same amount, and I was using a coffee scoop. Actually, I have it. This one, which came with my French press, and I thought I used the same amount, but it just didn't taste right. It was weak and watery, and so I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna redo this and add a bunch more coffee to it and make sure that I've got enough for the amount of water, and it should taste fine. And it did. It did taste fine. But that started a snowball effect for me, thinking, you know, if I want my coffee to consistently taste good, I need to consistently use the right amount of coffee for the amount of water. And so I started searching, okay, how do I do this? So of course, being the personality that I am, I quickly gravitated to using a scale. And we'll get into how to use it later, but the reason why I liked it is because to me it seemed a lot more simple and a lot more widely applicable to different brewing methods, rather than using a scoop and just filling your brewer up to a certain amount. Now, I don't want to act like scoops are bad. I mean, I have scoops. I kept the old one, and I have this lovely one as well. Why on earth would I have them and use them even if I use a coffee scale? Well, the simple answer is because they're really handy. I mean, if you're gonna store coffee in an airscape like I do, the scoop just fits inside the tub. You don't need to use a scoop if you're using a scale, but it is actually pretty handy. I don't want to act like using scoops is a bad idea or that they don't work, because they actually work really well for certain types of coffee brewers, like the French press or any kind of automatic coffee maker that uses a set amount of water. The reason why it works is because, well, you just put everything in the carafe and go to a consistent mark. If it tastes good, do that again. The reason why it didn't work for me all those years ago is because I didn't follow that basic principle. Use a consistent amount of scoops and fill the carafe up to a set level. And the same thing is true with any kind of automatic coffee maker. If you use a consistent number of scoops for a consistent amount of water, you're gonna get a consistent result. And even if that result is initially not quite what you want, let's say it's a little bit weak, well, just up the number of scoops or reduce the amount of water. It's very simple, very easy. And this actually brings me to kind of an interesting little point, which is that coffee beans are not a consistent size, nor are they a consistent weight. So if we look at these three coffees, we have two Kona Earth coffees. These are 100% Kona coffee. This one here on the end is from a different company, which I'm not gonna get into who it comes from because that's not important. The importance is that this is much, much more darkly roasted than either of these. This is Kona Earth's darkest roast, and this is significantly darker. savor. And typically when it comes to grading coffee, the higher the density of the coffee, the higher the value of the coffee. And this also comes from what altitude it's grown at. So a coffee like this that is very, very cheap is normally grown at low altitude, has a much lower density, so that when you roast it, there's less material there to become good flavor. So as a result, you tend to roast it a lot longer, which actually makes the coffee even lighter. And so if you look here, these are both far denser of coffees than this one is, and they've been roasted less, so they're keeping even more of that inherent density as a percentage than this one is. But if you look at these 3 cups, this is 30 grams, this is 30 grams, and this is 30 grams. And yeah, if you look at the extremes between the Kona Earth Pea Berry and this stuff, yeah, there's a little difference. There's a tiny little difference, but the truth is, there's hardly any noticeable difference at all. I'm showing you this because people who are proponents of the scale will act like you can't accurately measure whole bean coffee with a scoop, which, I mean, you can't do it quite as accurately with a scoop, but you can do it pretty darn close. 30 grams of coffee is enough coffee for 2 people. So, if I can't tell the eyeball test that there's really very much difference in the volume between these 3 cups, then, I probably can't taste the difference either. So I'm not gonna say you can't accurately measure whole bean coffee or pre-ground coffee with a scoop. That's just not true. And another thing that people will say to try and discourage you from using a coffee scoop is that, well, they're all different sizes. That may have been true in the past, but this one from Planetary Designs, this is 2 tablespoons. This one from Bodum, really common coffee brand, this is also 2 tablespoons. I have this one here that came with my AeroPress. This also is 2 tablespoons. So the industry standard is 2 tablespoons. And sometimes you'll find some outliers, but as a general rule, if you're reading a recipe that calls for scoops and it doesn't tell you exactly how big they are, assume they're 2 tablespoons. That's kind of become the standard. And so for any kind of brewer that is using a consistent amount of water, you can easily use a scoop and adjust whether it's whole bean or pre-ground coffee, which don't use pre-ground coffee. If you can help it, it just doesn't taste as good. But regardless of the situation, a scoop will work just fine. You might have to experiment a little bit and try your best to be very consistent in how many scoops you use, but even using a partial scoop, you can eyeball it and say, oh, that looks like about half. And you know what? If your coffee seems to taste best to you with 2.5 scoops, I don't think it's that hard to get a decent level of consistency when using the same size scoop with the same coffee maker. But you see, there's a problem that you run into when you're using a pour over, which is one of the most common ways to brew specialty coffee. So let me show you. This is a Chemex, a type of pour over. And I think the best way to explain this is to actually make some coffee with it so you can see what's going on here. Hold on a second. Ooh. This is the Full City Classic that I'm using today. Take the filter paper, open up a ply, stick it in here so that you got 3 plies next to the spout. Just give it a rinse with some hot water, make the paper stick in place, as well as it kind of preheats the brewer a bit so that you brew at a hotter temperature, which is helpful. Dump out your preheat water. All right, so now the carafe is empty. I'm gonna add my coffee. I'm using 30 grams of coffee rather than a set number of scoops. So I dump that into the cone. All right, so I know how much coffee I have in here, whether I scooped it or used a scale, doesn't matter. But how much water do I add? I mean, how would I even know? See, for me, this is not an expensive kettle that I bought, and it's the one that I have, and it heats the water, so I could pre-measure the water into the kettle and just use all of it. But you know what, it's even easier? Let me show you. Turn on the scale, stick it on, tear it out. I should probably get a bigger dedicated coffee scale, shouldn't I? Oh well. So you start the timer and you add some water, and you add twice as much water as you have coffee beans. So we're gonna go for or coffee grounds, I should say. So about 60 grams. Give it a swirl and let all the carbon dioxide come out. Well, how do I know that I added twice as much water as coffee? Well, because I weighed it, right? The scale tells me I put in 30 grams of coffee, put in 60 grams of water. It's easy, really easy. And to me, that's actually the appeal of using a scale. You see, before I started using a scale, I thought it was more complicated and more like fiddly and finicky. But the truth of the matter is, it's actually the easiest way to do this because you just look at the number, right? If you have a preset recipe that says add X amount of water, you just go until the number is, well, correct. That's all you gotta do. You don't have to think about it too hard at all, you know? You don't have to sort of measure, okay, within a set amount of time, I filled the brewer up X amount to make sure that I've actually added the correct amount of water, anything like that. All you have to do is read the number on the scale. And when the number says 500, whoa, 499.5, I'm gonna leave it. We're within half a gram, I think that's fine. But that tells me that I have exactly the right amount of coffee for water as a ratio between the two. And I know that I have the right ratio because it's a well-established recipe to use 60 grams of coffee per 1 liter of brewing water. We're done. It's too hot, but that is so good. Nutty. Balanced, grassiness. Sorry, this is not a coffee tasting. Where was I? Let me explain this whole ratio system so that you can understand how to apply it to different amounts of coffee and different kinds of brewers. And what you should understand is that because 1,000 grams is the same as 1 liter of water, you can actually use the number of grams like a decimal point and multiply the amount of coffee you're using. Stick with me, this is actually not hard. Let's say you want half a liter of coffee or 500 grams of water. So we're gonna start with 60 grams of coffee and 1 liter of water. Well, let's say we want half of that. Well, how would we do that? You could take each number and cut it in half. Half of a liter, 0.5 of a liter, or 500 grams, right? So you just think about how many grams you want, and you express it instead of as a whole number, 500 grams, write it as 0.5. Multiply 0.5 times 60, and what do you get? You get half of 60. Half of your water, half of your coffee, 30 grams, and 500 grams. Well, let's say you want to do a quarter of that. Very simple. 250 grams is a quarter of a liter. So you just write that instead of 250, you write it as 0.25, which is the decimal of a quarter. You multiply 0.25 times your 60 grams, and you get 15 grams. The whole number of grams can easily become a decimal just by putting a decimal in front of the number. 500 grams or 600 grams for 2 full cups of coffee like myself, whatever it is that you like. So you always have a consistent ratio between the two amounts. And when you're using a scale to measure both your coffee and your water, you don't need multiple measuring systems, you only need one, and you are using the same number system. Instead of using a set number of scoops and a number of ounces and trying to think about how those relate to each other and adjusting that up or down depending upon how many people you're serving in that moment, all you have to do is use a consistent ratio. And you measure it on one device using one metric, and it's very, very easy. And actually, if you like your coffee a little bit stronger, it's very easy to just go a little bit stronger. What about 65 grams or 70 grams? And you don't have to do the math in your head. Almost all of us is carrying what would have been the equivalent of a supercomputer in our pocket in the form of our smartphone. But the whole beauty of this system is not to make your life more complicated, but actually less complicated. So that whether or not you're brewing a French press, or you're brewing a pour over, or you're brewing anything, all you have to do is stick it on the scale and put in the water that you want. And you will always get a great tasting cup. And if you don't, it's either because you weren't paying attention and added too much water, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, or because maybe that 60 grams per liter ratio is too strong or too weak for your particular brewing method. Not every coffee brewer uses the same ratio. The majority of the most common coffee brewers use a 60 grams per liter starting point. But you notice how I'm saying it's a starting point. You don't need to stay there. If you want your coffee stronger, you can easily and consistently raise up that amount of coffee relative to the amount of water, and then you can get the perfect cup of coffee every time. And that's really the point. The point here is not about being needlessly precise, but actually about making life simple and easy. It's all about making your morning routine less cluttered, less complicated. I'm not saying get rid of your coffee scoop. I didn't get rid of my coffee scoops. They're really useful. They're really handy. Whether you're digging coffee out of a bag or out of an airscape or out of any kind of container, whether it's pre-ground or whole bean, scoops are great, even if you measure with them, or you just use them to move the coffee from the one container into the container on the scale. But even if you don't use the scale to measure your coffee beans, because, well, you've had great success, using a scale to measure your water is the simplest and easiest way to make sure that you get the right amount of water for that coffee. And I hope this helps you, and I hope you understand that this is not meant to discourage you from using a scoop or even encourage you into using a scale, but to rather give people who want consistently good coffee and don't know how to do it on their own a roadmap forward, an easy path forward to make sure that their coffee always tastes the way that they want. So go make yourself a cup of coffee. Cheers.